Good afternoon, everybody. So let us start our class. So we are discussing exception handling for C++ and C# and Java. So meanwhile, I want to give you a reminder that how many of you have had a chance to log into D2L? On the D2L, I am posting some discussion topic that I told you that I was expecting your participation. So let me go to the D2L system. And this is your section. Okay, so for the string operation, for this test, you may not have question for string operation. But for the final, maybe. Okay, for the stack and QE and recursive methods, I posted several discussion topic. Okay, if you do not like it, then I can withdraw this topic. Okay, I have almost disclosed almost 50 to 60% questions for the upcoming test. If I see that you are participating actively, then I may post more prospective questions. Otherwise, if you do not like, then let me know, I can delete this. Okay. So how many of you are not willing to participate in the discussion topic? Is there anyone has any restriction or any problem? Anyone has any problem in joining on this discussion topic? Okay.
I'm fine with participating in them. I actually appreciate them, but I'm a little bit confused whether or not they're mandatory.
It's not mandatory. I mentioned that. It's not mandatory. It's really optional. And I wanted to see you that you practice. And from some students, we are hearing that you are confused about the question style, what kind of questions will be for the upcoming test. Anyone has any confusion about that? In some of the class, I explicitly declared that for this 30-minute or 50-minute class, you will have at least 20% for the upcoming test question. Right? So that means I already disclosed some questions already. These are the similar questions. If you practice this, then you should do well. You may not get exactly this type question, but if you understand this, you should get some similar questions, and then you should be able to do that. Okay, let us say by next day, if I see your active participation, then I will post more, or otherwise I will not post, or I will delete, whatever you suggest. Okay, we were discussing exception handling. Okay, and I presented a real life scenario, how to handle exceptions or accident in our real life on highway or roadway. An exception is like an accident that happens unexpectedly. Sometimes there are some exceptions that you might be aware ahead of time. You will be noticed ahead of time that there is a possibility of exception, so that you can take some measures ahead of time. But for most of the cases, you may not get that warning. So this is why we need to add some codes or take some measures in order to handle exceptions. Okay, so I added some C# slide. So it's actually for exception class hierarchy for Java and C# are pretty similar. This is for C#. I added this slide, and maybe I will add more C# slide. So by our next class. So these are the common exception: arithmetic exception, divide by zero exception, overflow exception, index out of range exception. In Java we said index out of bound exception. Okay, so we discussed that we use try and catch block in order to handle exception. So we put our suspected codes that might generate an exception within the try block, and we use one or more catch blocks just right after the try block without keeping any other code in between. So if an exception happens on the try block, then the catch block catches the exception and handle it. How does it handle? It depends on your code. How do you write your code? How do you want to handle it? If an exception happens in the try block for a statement, that statement does not execute it. That statement is skipped. You may have multiple catch statements. So if you have multiple catch statements, all of the catch statements are different, must be different in terms of their exception argument type. So this exception is like kind of method overloading with same name with different argument type. And we know that we discussed there is a finally block. It is optional. You can have a finally block. Okay, the finally block contains some codes that must be executed, that will always execute no matter whether an exception happen or does not happen. So if you want to work with a data file, if you need to open a file, so before close your program, you must need to close the file. That especially for handling database operation, you have to put code in your finally block. This is a typical syntax of try, catch, finally block. You will have only one try statement, and you can have multiple catch statements, and all the way you would have at the end you will have finally block. So within the try and catch block, you cannot have other statements, any other statements or fun statements. So we in our last class we ended here, right? We ended here with a scenario of an exception handling in our real life. So for instance, if a highway has multiple lanes, so each of the lanes, for instance, if an accident happens, that is a try. Okay. Then each of the lanes are each of the catch blocks. And the emergency lane is the finally block. No matter whether an accident happens in on a freeway or highway or not, so this emergency lane is always kept free to be used by some special people who give special service to people, like medical ambulances or fire trucks or police officers. If they find that usually they do not use this lane, but if they find that all of these lanes are blocked, then they use this finally or emergency lane. Similarly, we put some codes that must need to be executed within the finally block. So this is what we discussed until our last class. Anyone has any questions so far? Okay, maybe in my last class your lectures was not recorded correctly, so I added another section video in your section. Please watch that. So anybody has any questions so far? Exception handling is an interesting topic. It's not that much tough, like implementing a linked list. Okay, this is pretty simple. Okay, so let us today learn something more about exception and exception handling. But before that, let me remind something. Okay, before that, remember the exception class hierarchy. So all the way top, this is for Java, but almost similar for C#. All the way at the top, we have object class, then the throwable subclass, then this throwable subclass has error subclass, then it has another exception subclass, then exception subclass has other subclasses, and you see the class hierarchy. You don't need to remember this class hierarchy, but just be familiar with some of these class name. For instance, index out of bound exception, array index out of bound exception, arithmetic exceptions, file not found exception, number format exception, illegal argument exception. Okay, just be familiar with some of the exception class exception types. We will need this. So exceptions are mainly classified as two types, checked and unchecked exceptions. So what are the exception of unchecked exceptions? Unchecked exception means the exception, those are the subclasses of error or you can say error and runtime exception. Okay, and the checked exception are any other types of exceptions. Okay, I will revisit this slide later, but let us see what it says. The unchecked exceptions are those for that subclass of error or runtime exceptions. So if we revisit the exception class hierarchy, so this is the throwable class. It has error and then exception subclass and then runtime exceptions and exceptions. So these type of exceptions, runtime exceptions and error, these two groups of exception are called unchecked exceptions. And other types of exceptions, these are called checked exceptions. Maybe if we go through other okay, so now we see that unchecked exception are those that are type of subclass of error or runtime exception. Okay, so for unchecked exception, it is not mandatory to use try and catch blocks to handle this kind of exceptions. It's good to use, but it's not mandatory. It's optional. But for the checked exceptions, your code must put in a try block, or the method that uses the course must acknowledge that the exception may occur by using a throws clause. We will discuss throws clause later today, within a few minutes. In the method header, just remember that. Try to remember that we will use throws keywords in the method header. That is an alternative way to use try block. Alternative of try block is to use throws keyword. Otherwise, what happens? So if you do not enclose checked exceptions within a try block or the method header with the throws keyword, then your compiler will generate error. Okay, that means our checked exceptions, for checked exceptions, we need to take measures. Otherwise, compiler will generate error. So this is an interview question for actually for high level, for advanced level students. If you understand exceptions, then sometime you might be asked questions. What is the difference between checked and unchecked exceptions? I just found it from online. Main thing is that checked exceptions are checked by compiler and so we will go through this. What is meant by checked by compiler and unchecked by compiler? Okay. But the slides are there. You have the okay. You can memorize the differences, but I don't like you to memorize. I want to explain you. I like you to understand. The most important thing that I would like you to remember that for unchecked exceptions, it shows recoverable conditions. Compiler shows how to fix it. And for the unchecked exception program, it shows programming error. So maybe you may find better explanation with explanation if you do Google search about checked and unchecked exceptions. But let me see. Let me see what our slides have this already. Okay, let me show this in a program. This is the first program we discussed last time, right? This program generates an exception for line number 12, I believe. Yes, line number 12, it generates an exception. Okay, so this generates an arithmetic exception, right? So now let us revisit our slide. So arithmetic exceptions. So an arithmetic exception is an unchecked exception, right? So even it is optional in your program, if you do not put this code within a try catch block, your compiler will not show any error message, but it may generate an error if you do not do that, don't handle that. So better to handle this with a try and catch block that we discussed maybe in this program. Yeah, we put this lines of code that might generate exceptions within a try and catch block. Okay, so that maybe did we discuss that this is the type of exception, arithmetic exceptions, and for this type we are declaring an object of this type. So this is why we are saying e.print stack trace. So you can say e instead of say, you can say ex or any name you can give. This is an object name, right? You can give any name. So when you say ex dot sorry, my computer is slow. You see that there are some methods that are coming from throwable class that is built in java.lang package. So you can use some of these methods. So for instance, we are using print stack trace. This is a method that it prints the throwable, and there are descriptions over here. It shows actually what kind of error exception is getting and what is the current stack situation. So other methods you can go through, and then you can go through other methods. You can check. So for this one, print text test, it prints these lines. This is the stack state. If I do not use this, okay. If I do not use this, then my program will not print the what kind of exception it got. Will not print that. So it's better to print the stack state. This one. And other codes, whatever you want to do, that is up to you. Up to how do you handle your exception. You can put any print statement over here, or you can alter your code that generated exception, whatever you like. This is an exception handling technique. Okay, so we discussed maybe this up to this last class as well. Okay, we are discussing checked and unchecked exceptions also. We'll go back there, but before that, I got the program. Okay, this program we say that we discuss that you can have multiple catch statements. So this is an example. The try catch. I have one try, then I have three catch statements, and I don't have finally over here, but I may have finally. So is that we may have multiple catch statements for only one try statement, and sometimes if you need it, you can have what is that called, a try or catch statement within another try or catch block. This is called inner try catch within the outer try block. It's possible to have like this. Okay, that's for like looping. Okay, so these programs code are from my book chapter. So it says J14, that means chapter 14. So actually I do not recommend you to write your class name like this way, but I wrote my class name this way so that I save all of my files, programs in sometimes one folder, and it was easy for me to quickly access any program and save the program. So this is why I saved the program like this way. But don't confuse about that. Okay, so what I was going to do, okay, this one. Okay, so when you use some methods, for instance, if you want to use buffer reader or input stream reader method, or input stream reader method, I believe some of you have already used this statement, throws. Okay, so this is that what we are discussing here. Here. This is a throw statement. So code that might generate a checked exception must be put inside a try block, or the word is important. Most important, the word. So if you use try block, then you do not need to use throws. But if you do not use try, then you need to put throws. You cannot use both. The method must acknowledge that the exception may occur by using a throws clause in the method header. So this is the method header. This is the place. So this my method setInt method. It acknowledges that it may generate an exception. What type of exception it may generate? An IOException. For instance, this method is trying to read to use keyboard in order to get a value. Okay. But for some reason there might be some occurrences. For instance, if your keys of your keyboard are plugged in incorrectly. For instance, you see the button number 5, but maybe it was put on button number A. So if you are pressing 5, but instantly by mistake it is getting A, character A. So that will be an error, right? That will be a mistake. Or sometime while you may do unexpected or unintentional mistakes. So anytime any mistake can happen, there is the most possibility of that may happen due to this line. You have a question here?
Is the throws claim in C#?
Yes. In our next class, I have a class, one more class. We will discuss more programs in our next class with C#. Let me finish today. So this is why if I do not use this, actually what is happening here, my read line method. So without using an appropriate measure, I cannot use the read line method. So our slide, it says this is a checked exception. So I have two ways. Either I have to put this code within a try-catch block, or I have to use throws keyword. That means this method is declaring that this method may throw an exception. So whoever is going to call this method must take an initiative. Okay. For instance, must take another measure. Be careful. For instance, that main method. This is the main method is going to use this. So the measure is that in order to use this method, setInt method, you see the setInt method is used here. setInt method. This method needs to be put again within try-catch block. And this catch statement will be identical with throws this type. So do you understand why it is showing an error? That means it is while declaring this read line. I wish I would find the code. So my computer is not responding. Okay, so the main thing is that here my setInt method is using the readline method that has a possibility to create an exception, to generate an exception, the most possibility. This is why in order to use this readline method, this statement must be put either within a try-catch block, or this method needs to be put throws. Use throws keyword and throws and yes, type exception. Okay. Okay. The throws keyword it is used, and then it says throws exception, and you have to put an exception type. What kind of exception it may throw? Okay. So in general, we know that in dev The read line method may generate an IOException. So, okay, so you can see if you say an IOException here. Let me show you the slide again. So this is IOException. This IOException is a subclass of exception class, right? You see that by this block diagram, the IOException is a subclass of exception class, right? And exception class is again a subclass of throwable class. Okay, so in your program, you can say IOException over here. If you know more specific what kind of exception it may occur, or you can put any upper level. For instance, if you are not sure that you see that IOExceptions, these are exceptions class, and these are subclass IOException. IOException has file not found, and then maybe a socket exception for this. Okay, if you are not sure that what kind of exception I may get, then you can put a familiar exception type, parent type, that is the exception, or even you can use throwable here. Remember that THROWABLE. So even here I can use exception, or I can use THROWABLE. But I cannot go lower level. Okay, so then these again here, oh sorry, unhandled exception, type throwable. Okay, throwable, should do mistake any? THROWABLE. Okay, this is actually in more in-depth discussion. This is actually out of bound of this course. You see that, so these, okay, I can see exception over here, or I can see IOException here. Okay, you can see maybe throwable here. Okay, sorry, then you can cast throwable here. So if you know, you see the throwable over here, you see throw an exception, then you can cast, you can put any, in the cast statement, you can put at least this IOException. Okay, last time I did a mistake actually. Let me fix it. So here, if you know that your program might generate an IOException, then you can cast at least IOException or throwable, upper level. So this is why here, if you put IOException here, you can go up over here. So it will cover more in depth. Okay. So now we understand why do we use sometimes these throws exceptions. Just this is an alternative way to use try catch. I could use try catch over here. For instance, here, instead of like using this, you see that my program is generating an error. So let me do a right click. Control+1. So it has two suggestions. It says as throws declaration. If I add this, that will be that one. Okay, and if I do not select that one, if I select the last one, this one, surround with try catch, you see that just I will select this one, it will be handled automatically. Return what? Local variables may not have been initialized. Okay. Okay. So this, you see that just I selected auto and then compiler enclosed this statement within the try and catch block, and I got an error because the string was not initialized. This is why I got that error. I fixed that. So my program should run. If I run this program, so it is asking me to enter an integer number. Okay, if I enter 45 as an integer, okay, then enter another integer, let me 50. So it is getting 45 divided by 50. What we are asked to divide the first number by the second number. But let us rerun this program and try to make a mistake. Okay. For instance, my first number is 45, and the second number, let me put it 0. So it got an exception, right? I put a 0. So division by 0. When I say division by 0, then you see that it got an arithmetic exception. Okay. And let me run it again and try to give another kind of exception, like 45. And instead of putting integer a, integer number, I am putting a non-integer number, right? A is not an integer number, right? It is a character. So if I want to print, enter this. So what will happen? It is showing me the number format exception. Okay. So this actually my original program code was use throws. Okay, so throws, now you understand what we are discussing about, what is that called, checked and unchecked exception. So that is a checked exception. Okay, this method, readline method, it generates exception, so we must handle it using with a try catch block or with a throw exception. We cannot use both. Can we use both? Wow. I don't thought. Sorry, I didn't thought that they can use. Okay, maybe double measure. Okay. So now we got an idea what is called unchecked exception and checked exception. So for our program again, for our first program, that is generating an exception, but that is unchecked exception. If program is not showing any error message, still I have exception. But the last program I discussed, it is generating a checked exception. So I need to handle it. Okay, so there are software engineering tips. Tips is that you must handle checked exception. Okay, and then there are some built-in exceptions, but still this might not be sufficient. We can create our own exception class, and we can define our own exception method. Maybe in our next class we will discuss this. Okay, we will just show you how to create our own exception class. And this is another interview question. What is the difference between throw and throws keyword? I just showed you how to use throws keyword. Here we use throws keyword. Throws. And there is a similar keyword that is called throw. Throw keyword is used to explicitly throw an exception. I don't have time today. Maybe in our next class I will show you an example of using throw. Maybe I have a program here. Maybe in one of my. You see here, I have throw. Use throw. In our next day we will discuss this. But meanwhile, please go through. This is a good interview question. Okay, throw and difference between throw and throws keyword. Okay, and another interview question is that the difference between final, finally, and finalized keywords. Maybe this is not only for Java, it is also similar for C#. Okay, so I have added some slides. I just got this from internet. Okay, in our next, so before you come to your next class, please spend some time, at least 20 minutes to read this lecture slides. And you know everybody that your test will be on next week, right? This Wednesday?
Yep.
Okay, and next Wednesday your test, okay? Be prepared.